Hello AP Biology students, let's go over the second section in Unit 7. And this is going to be another section where I don't have the students take a lot of notes because it's about Charles Darwin. And obviously he's one of my favorite scientists. However, a lot of the history about Darwin and how he came to the theory of evolution by natural selection really doesn't need to be memorized or learned to understand what the actual process is. So remember, any of the slides that have a black background, I don't have the students take notes on. Darwin was born in England in 1809, and he was brought up in a somewhat wealthy household. His father was a doctor, however, his mother died at a very young age. The reason that I mention this is that Darwin had to face the outcomes of death very early on in life. And I think this kind of changed his perspective of just how life in general works. Now, as a kid, he was very interested in nature. He loved to take nature walks and just collect beetles and other things. But eventually his father would send him to medical school, and he hated that route. He actually failed out of medical school. He hated the sight of blood. I remember reading a book about him watching, I think it was a child going through surgery, and they were screaming because anesthesia wasn't really a thing back then. So he just dropped out because he absolutely hated the thought of blood. Darwin then went to school to be a clergyman, and he actually loved his science classes but really didn't enjoy his other classes. He became an assistant to the botanist John Henslow, and this is where he gained a better understanding of how to classify plants and animals. He also became an assistant to Adam Sedgwick, who is a founder of the modern geology understanding of deep time. And this is where Darwin started to understand the Earth was not just 1,000 or a couple thousand years old. He started to understand that the Earth was millions to billions of years old. Again, the reason why I go over this is to show how the shaping of Darwin's mind led him to the theory that he would later understand. Because he would have to break away from the conventional understanding that the Earth was very young to the Earth is very old. Now, after school, Darwin had a tough time trying to figure out where his place in life would be, and he eventually was able to go on a trip called the Voyage of the HMS Beagle. The original voyage was to map out the South American coastline for 2 years, and it eventually took 5 years in total. But a lot of people think that Darwin went on this trip to be a naturalist. However, he just went on this trip to be a companion of Captain Fitzroy. During this time, there were social classes, and the captain couldn't socialize with his workers. So they usually brought along companions to just go along with them on these trips. And Darwin finally, got his father to allow him to go on this trip and just to be a companion for the captain. Darwin did obviously become sort of a naturalist on this trip, but that wasn't the main goal in the original plan. As you can see, they mapped out the coastline of South America, but they also visited many other locations around the world. One of these locations is the volcanic islands of the Galapagos, which is about 600 miles off the west coast of Ecuador in South America. Now, these islands are very different from each other, even though they are a grouping of islands. They originate at different time periods because they're, again, volcanic. I remember talking about this years ago before I actually visited the Galapagos Islands, but I didn't really realize how different each one of these islands is. This is me back in 2018. I was fortunate enough to have a school that visited the islands, but we got to spend about a week visiting the different islands and their locations and learning more about Darwin and his research. One of the things that Darwin noticed on the islands were there were different species or different types of tortoises for each island. I got this really cool picture of one of these Galapagos tortoises. I cannot tell you how massive these things are. The pictures just don't do these species justice. He also noticed this in the bird species, and this perplexed him. If special creation was correct, why would there be a different species for each island and not just one species for all of the islands? So this is the notes that I have my students take about Darwin. First of all, there is genetic variation in populations, and the two main reasons there is genetic variation is mutations and meiosis. Now, Darwin didn't know any of this about DNA or genetic variability, but he at least saw variation in the different species he saw on the islands. He also saw that adaptations that organisms had helped them survive better on specific islands. And adaptations are just inherited characteristics that improve an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. We're going to learn later on that these adaptations are a result of natural selection. These adaptations help organisms survive and reproduce versus other organisms without those adaptations. Their ability to survive and reproduce is called fitness. You may think of fitness as like athletic ability, but in evolutionary biology terms, we look at fitness as how well an organism survives and reproduces. Now, I love using this meme, but understand that Darwin didn't instantly understand evolution after the Galapagos Islands. He gained a lot of evidence and understanding of species on the islands. However, it's not like he totally understood natural selection when he left those islands. It took him more than 20 years to analyze specimens, correspond with different scientists, and just work on his theory. That's another major difference between Darwin and all the other scientists from 7.1, is that Darwin collected data and evidence and his understanding before he actually published his work. He did a lot of the grunt work of just analyzing data and just writing about his theory before actually publishing. Now, I know we haven't actually gone over what natural selection is. That's going to be in the next section.